Okay, for the second part of this chapter, we're going to be talking about language. So, we're going to be talking about all kinds of fun stuff here. I want to first explain this picture of this chimpanzee. This is Kanzi. She lives in Japan. She is one of the most sophisticated chimpanzees as far as her language learning abilities. You can see here on the left side of the picture that there's a bunch of really crazy pictures on the screen, and her keepers and the researchers that work with her, they use these little pictograms, kind of like hieroglyphics, to represent different things and words and objects in her environment. And so for Kanzi, she has to use this screen to ask for food, to ask for different toys. She can communicate her wishes and her needs and her desires to the keepers, and they can communicate back to her. She's really learned some pretty sophisticated sentence structures by using these pictograms, which is pretty darn cool. I think Kanzi recently passed away, which is sad. There's an article on Canvas about her that you should check out if you're interested in this. And we'll talk some more in a little bit about animals and their language learning ability. So, what is language? It's a system for communicating thoughts and feelings with other people. It is an arbitrary set of signals that vary geographically. And what we mean by that is that we each use different languages depending on where we are in the world. So, Spanish is different than English. There's no particular reason why the sound that makes the word apple would reference an apple. We have just kind of all agreed upon that as our shared word in English for the word apple, or for the object apple. It's also a way to connect with others, even across space and time. So I can call someone on the phone, or you can record my voice as I'm doing as I record this, and you can listen to it later on, and you can understand what I mean. And I'm transferring this message to you through language. I'm sharing my thoughts and my knowledge from my brain using meat sounds, using language. The sounds are coming out of my mouth that are being recorded and then listened to later on. They're going into your brain. I mean, it's really incredible. We can also have recordings from over 100 years ago and listen to them. We can, if we have writing, which a lot of cultures have writing, not all of them. Language does not have to include writing. It's actually a fairly new thing. It's about, I think, 8 to 10,000 years old. I don't know. You can ask Mr. Clevenger how old writing is, but there's been languages before that. But with written language, we can write something down and save it, and someone else hundreds of years later can read it and listen to it or understand it and get that language into their minds and appreciate that. So you guys will be reading Shakespeare in English class, and Shakespeare was 500 years ago, and we can read his words and go into his mindset of that time period. That's incredible. We can understand his jokes and the sadness and the joy of the people in his plays. And he can transfer that to us through language over half a millennia. I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. So language is a really, really neat thing. The evolution of language, believe it began with the FOXP2 gene developing in humans. Of course, that was our hominid ancestors who lived in Africa, and then it spread across the world as humans migrated. We can actually trace how languages developed and evolved through roots of different words. So English is a Germanic-based language because German groups moved to the British Isles and established there. But of course, as the groups were separated, words changed. Like, we know that languages change over time. You guys use words that your parents don't use, or that they do, they use them ironically. And your future children will use different ones. That's why when you read Shakespeare, even though it's English, it's hard to read. Even books like The Crucible, that's, a couple hundred years ago, and that's different language. It's also how we have different sounds, like the British version of English, it has sounds different than the American version of English, but also within the United States. people in New England speak differently than people in Boston and people in Texas and people in California. It's all American English, but we also have our different accents. And it's because groups of people are separated from one another over time and they kind of shift in the way that they say things. And usually it's cultural drivers who shift the language most readily. So, um, British monarchs started using different vowel sounds, and then the rest of the population mimicked them. And the reason that they started using different vowel sounds is because, well, they were from the royalty were from the Habsburg family, and those were the ones that were really inbred and had funny jaws and didn't have mouths that were normally shaped, and so they actually shifted the way that they speak because of that. When the British came to the colonies at first, they actually sounded more like Americans, like people in Boston, than the British people do now. So it's actually kind of interesting. Um, the thing is, though, as cultures become more connected and people move around and the world has become kind of a smaller place, it's more easy to communicate, some languages have begun to die off. People have stopped speaking them because they use the language of a more dominant culture. So think about, maybe your family's history. If they came to the United States, do you still speak that mother tongue that your ancestors spoke? So, for example, my family came from Germany through Ellis Island in the 1920s. My grandmother knew a few words of German, but my mom doesn't know any, and I don't really know any German. I know a couple words here and there, a couple smatterings, but I don't speak German, even though I have German roots. If your family is from Central or South America, we're in an area of the country where we have a lot of cultural pride as far as Hispanic culture and Haitian culture, Brazilian culture. But do you think that in the next generation of your family, like your children, will they still speak Spanish or Portuguese or Creole? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe some of your parents, are from another country and they speak, say, let's say Spanish, and maybe you know a few phrases here and there, you can kind of understand it, but can you really speak it? Or maybe you can't. Or maybe you learned it as a kid and now you've forgotten because you went to school and you were part of this dominant language culture of English. This is happening all over the world, and especially languages that were already starting off with smaller populations now don't have any native speakers. And there are no new speakers coming up because parents don't know it and they're not teaching their kids. Maybe grandma and grandpa know, but the kids aren't interested. And so lots of languages are going extinct. They estimate that there are about 6,000 languages in the world, but the big ones, there's maybe 30 to 50 major languages, and the rest of them are dying off. They say, and within the next 100 years, we're going to lose about half of the languages that are on this planet right now. There's some really interesting efforts going on by Rosetta Stone as well as some other companies that are trying to preserve endangered languages. There are 2 videos about this on the playlist, but you can also go to Endangered Languages Project. I believe it's .org. If you just Google Endangered Languages Project, it comes up. On there, you can see a map, and there's a map of the world, and they'll have different spots marked where different endangered languages exist. They'll tell you approximately how many speakers are left, and if you click more, you can get more information. They'll even maybe have sound recordings or a little dictionary about that language so you can learn more. You can zoom in on Florida and you'll see that in Florida, in the Everglades, you have the Miccosukee language, and there are fewer than 500 speakers left in the Miccosukee language. And you can see some words on how to say different basic things like mother, father, child, numbers, different animals are all listed on there. And it's kind of sad. But beyond just, the sad or emotional factor of losing languages, why do you think it's important to hold on to these languages? Why should we preserve them if otherwise, they economically just aren't as important anymore? So take a minute and think about that. Watch these videos, and we're going to come back to this later on in this section when we talk about linguistic determinism. So here's a nice graphic of old world language families, including mostly Indo-European. You can kind of see how these languages have kind of sprouted off from each other. So we have a branch here that is Indo-Iranian, which is going more into the Indic and Asian, South Asian languages, and then we have the European languages that branch off, and then we have the Slavic, Romance, and Germanic languages. So Romance languages you probably have heard of before. They have Latin roots. So we have Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, and French. English we have is part of that Germanic tree, but that's also Germany as well as Dutch. And kind of Greek is kind of snuck in there in the Hellenic languages. And it's kind of interesting to see how the spread and the pathway of them, and they show them here on these maps in the center of the image. You're probably like, well, where's all the Asian languages? So here's an image of that. I know this one's not nearly as pretty as the other one, but this gives you a little bit more. But this is still focusing on European and Asian languages, these old world languages. They don't have any of the languages from the Americas. But it is kind of interesting to see how African languages are on the one on the left, as well as Mandarin, Thai, Cantonese, Tibetan, but I don't see Japanese on here. So I still don't think this is a perfectly comprehensive list, but I think you kind of can see some of this. It is really quite. Oh, Japanese is on the right map. I'm sorry, but it's pretty interesting to check out. So here's some key terms. So we do understand from our discussion on Temple Grandin that our thinking heavily relies on language. It is the structure of our memory system, and we talked about that back in chapter 7. And here's some more key terms we need to understand. So semantics is the meaning of words within languages. It's kind of like your little dictionary in your brain. So the word apple has a meaning of this fruit that is sweet, has a thin skin, usually is red, but can also be pink and green. Phonemes are basic speech sounds of a language. So ba, li, ro, ta, di, pa. Those are all phonemes. So for example, the word baby is made up of two phonemes, bay and b. It's not necessarily the letters, it's kind of how they're combined into basic sounds that then make up our syllables. Morphemes are the smallest units of a language, so written units, such as syllables or words. So the letter R, B, W, and A are all morphemes. And then syntax is our grammatical rules and structure, the rules for putting things together. So if I use the sentence, the boy hit the girl, it has a different meaning than the girl hit the boy. Semantics-wise, if there was no syntax, those would mean the same thing. It just has to do with the order. But with the syntax in place, we know that it's a very different sentence. We go back to our biology of language. We've talked about this in chapter 2. We have Broca's area and Wernicke's area. And if a person has damage to these things, you can have aphasias. So remember, Broca's area is for the control of speech production. So again, that's connected with our motor cortex for moving our mouth and our lips. So Broca's area is speech production. The person has Broca's aphasia. They can understand speech, but they can't speak it. So they may only have a word or a couple words or sounds, but they can't make productive speech. Wernicke's area is for speech understanding, so speech reception. These people can talk, but they can't understand incoming speech. To them, it sounds like gibberish. So we talked about this again in chapter 2. This was our speech areas, but this is important for you guys to remember in this chapter as well. So everyone always asks, can animals use language? The short answer to that is no, but animals do have communication systems. So the difference between human language and animal communication is that human language is what we consider to be generative, which means that we can communicate an infinite number of ideas from a finite number of parts. We have a finite dictionary of words, but we can use that to convey an infinite number of different ideas. You can make a sentence that has never been said or heard before in human history. You can do that with our language. Animals cannot do that with their communication systems. Human language is also recursive, which means that it can build upon itself without limits. So recursive, again, is used to describe a language with units, such as sentences and phrases, that contain themselves other sentences and phrases within phrases. So you can kind of embed phrases within a sentence to convey a deeper or more subtle meaning. So that's where you have like subclauses in a sentence. Animals cannot do that. And animal language or human language uses displacement, which means that we can refer to things that are not directly present. And this is a huge one for animals. They can't do this. Animals cannot use language to describe things that aren't there. Like your dog can't bark about things about the future or the past. Now, chimpanzees seem to have some sort of memory that they can communicate back and forth with things that aren't currently present. They can talk about memories of a time that they saw a balloon and things like that if they know sign language, or Kanzi with her pictographs. But it's not recursive and not generative. They can't come up with new novel phrases using these languages. But animals do have very complex forms of communication. And humans have gone through very great efforts to teach animals to teach animals different human languages. So I don't know if you guys know who this is on the right, but this is Alex. He's an African gray parrot. He is known as the Einstein of parrots. So you know parrots, like they can learn human words, but all they're doing is what we call parroting. They're just mimicking you. They maybe can use it within context. So I had a parrot, my husband had a parrot, I should say, that I lived with. And if I picked up my purse or put on my shoes, he'd say bye. If I came in the door, he'd say hello. But he couldn't create these new novel sentences. Alex is a little bit more sophisticated than this. He learned a bunch of letters, colors, materials. He could tell you shapes and things like that. So for an example, if you held up a cotton ball and said, "What's this?" he would say cotton. Or actually, the phrase they use was "what matters?" Like, what is this made out of? Or if you held up a wood block, he'd say "what matter?" He'd say wood. If you handed him a metal key, he'd say metal. You could also hold up two keys and say how many, he'd say two. You could hold up two green keys and a blue key and say how many green keys, and he'd tell you there were two green keys, and he wouldn't count the third blue key. He was really sophisticated. So there's a video about him here. It's linked on the YouTube playlist. Check it out. He's really impressive. But sadly, he did die a few years ago. And they'll tell you the story about that in the video. It's sad. But Alex is a pretty cool story. And at this point, I don't think there's another parrot they found who's been quite as smart as him. There's also been chimpanzees. We saw Kanzi at the beginning of this section. But chimpanzees have also been taught sign language with various degrees of effort, as you know, and so have gorillas, and so have orangutans. But the most famous gorilla is Coco the gorilla. She passed away about 6 months ago, I believe, at least at the recording time of this video. She was famous. Mr. Rogers has video with her. Robin Williams got to hang out with Coco. She was famous because she had a little kitten that she loved and she would play with, and there was children's books written about her. So she was very famous. But that work kind of came simultaneously with work on chimpanzees. The thing with gorillas is that their hands are kind of like hockey mitts. Like you can't do a whole lot of signs very well with those hands. Also, the woman who worked with Coco, she kind of over-exaggerated Coco's abilities. And so people who actually knew sign language would watch those videos of Coco and be like, she's not making any sense. Chimpanzees, though, they have hands that are a little bit more like ours. So they're able to do more signs that are more closely related to human sign language. And so the first major study that they did on chimpanzees using sign language was a chimpanzee named Nim. And we'll talk about this guy. His name was Noam Chomsky. And so he was a famous linguist who believed that we learned language because we had brain parts that were readied for language. So they named this chimpanzee Nim Chimpsky after Noam Chomsky. It's a funny little play on words. There was a movie documentary that came out about him a couple years ago, and it's on Amazon if you want to like watch it. It's like a couple bucks to download it, but I have the trailer linked for you guys in the YouTube playlist. You can watch that. So with Nim, he was this poor woman. She was a graduate student of this guy. the professor, and she had recently had a baby, and so the professor was like, "Hey, how would you like to raise this baby chimpanzee alongside your baby?" And so she said yes, because grad school. And she brought the chimpanzee home, and so she was raising the chimpanzee. She was feeding it, dressing it up, doing all the normal family stuff with her baby and the baby chimpanzee Nim. And she was supposed to teach him sign language. Well, she didn't speak sign language on her own. She was learning sign language in order to do this project. But if you can imagine being a graduate student, raising your own child, that's already craziness, plus then raising a chimpanzee and having to teach it sign language and keep records of this progress, like that's just too much to ask. So she had Nim for about a year, and then the guy in charge didn't like that she wasn't giving him the progress that she had said she could do, and so he took the chimpanzee away from her. Imagine you had a dog in your house for a year and then took it away. And then he gave it to another woman, or gave Nim to another woman to raise, and she was able to chart out more progress, and he did learn a lot of signs. But chimpanzees, they're very big, strong, powerful animals, especially once they hit maturity. And so around age 5, Nim got too big and strong, and they retired him. And that was kind of the viewpoint at that point was, okay, these are just animals, and we will use them for our research purposes, and then we don't need them after that, and we can get rid of them. So sadly, Nim was retired, but I don't know if he's still alive. This was back in the 60s and 70s, so I don't imagine he's still alive today. I should look into that. One of the big criticisms of the project, though, besides the logistical nightmare that it was that they were using verbal communication and expecting Nim to sign back, and they use signs along with verbal communication, but it's not as rich because he couldn't use words to speak back, verbal language, and then another study with a chimpanzee named Washoe, she was taught sign language by people who had at least some minimal training in sign language, but then she was, people who worked with her were only allowed to speak to her in sign language and communicate with one another in sign language, not in any verbal language. And so she learned signs more readily, and quite a few more, and she had more flexibility with her sign language usage. And nice with females, they could have them for a few more years before they got too unwieldy. She was then retired to some retirement facility for other experimental usage animals. And the guy, one of the graduate students who worked with her, actually went with her. Like he had such a connection with her, he actually followed her. His name is Roger Fouts. He then eventually set up a research lab at Central Washington University, last I heard, where Washoe, who I think has since passed away, but she was able to live out her years with a bunch of other chimpanzees who were taught sign language. She actually taught her son, her baby, sign language, which was really cool. That was the first time we saw intergenerational teaching of sign language. But she still did not have true language. She had a very sophisticated form of communication to use with humans. That's a really cool story, and I have a book about her on my back bookshelf if you'd like to borrow it, called Next of Kin. So going back into learning language. So here's this guy, Noam Chomsky, as I mentioned before. He took a nativist approach, which means that they believe that a lot of things are inborn in humans that ready us for our world. He believed in this concept of universal grammar, meaning that he believed that all languages use a similar grammatical structure, that those rules can then be written into our brains before birth, so that way when we are born, we already have some basics in our brain readying us to learn language. He also believed that the environment was too poor to provide enough stimulation for us to learn language as rapidly as we do as children. He also believed the brain had a language module that was ready to take language in. Like Broca's and Wernicke's areas are there just to suck in language. But this idea of the universal grammar has never been verified. There is no grammatical structures that are present across all languages. The poverty of stimulus has been kind of debunked. We know that babies hear so much language from the moment they're born. Also, we talked about prenatal language exposure. Babies come into the world knowing the intonation patterns of their native language from their prenatal exposure. And while the brain has areas of the brain, there are areas of our brain that are specified for language. They also, if you don't get language, they can be used for other things. You can also have, a person could have damage, a child could have damage to those areas as an infant and still learn language, because other brain regions will adapt. So none of his theories are really held up, although some people still do believe him. On the other side, the behaviorist approach says that the environment is rich enough in that we structure language that we speak to babies in a way that makes it easier for them to learn it, using infant-directed speech in particular. And we talked about this more in chapter 3 as well.
All right. One of the other really interesting terms or phenomena that we have in linguistics is what's called linguistic relativity. It's also called the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis or the Whorfian hypothesis. It goes by a bunch of different names. But what this says is that the vocabulary that a person uses can affect how he or she thinks about a topic. So, for an example, if you have grown up in Florida and you haven't spent a significant amount of time up north where you regularly get snow, you probably don't have a rich vocabulary for different words describing snow. So, you may know of snow or icy. You may have heard of maybe sleet. But people who grow up around the snow or have a relationship with snowy climates, skiers and stuff like that, they have a bunch of different terms that they use to describe different types of snow without having to actually use the word snow. So flurries, or it's icing or concrete. There's just different terminology that is important to understand that phenomenon in a rich sense. We kind of do the same thing here in Florida with rain. We don't just say it's raining outside. Oh, we say it's misting, or it's pouring outside. It's like a monsoon. We have a very rich set of vocabulary to describe this phenomenon. Now, these examples, the snow and the rain example, aren't quite what I mean by linguistic relativity, but that's kind of an easy example to understand it. And a better way to understand this term is how objects are gendered in certain languages. So, if I say apple, in English, apple, we don't have gendered nouns. So apple, we probably don't really assign a gender to it, but manzana in Spanish is feminine, la manzana. And so someone might have a more feminine connotation of what an apple is. Um, but I believe it's like desk and table. One is masculine and one is feminine. And it's interesting. Like it kind of changes your perception of the object when you have the gender kind of assigned to it. So they've done research on people who come from these languages that have gendered nouns, and they see that they have different perception of objects than people who come from ungendered areas. Or again, like in one language, it's feminine, the other is masculine, and then how that gets reconciled in a person who speaks both languages. There's another interesting concept of this relating to directionality. So if I want to say, where something is, in relation to my body, I would say, oh, my desk is to the left of me and my kitchen's to the right. But in the Aboriginal language, they don't use directionality in relation to oneself. They just use cardinal direction. So I would say, oh, the kitchen's to my east. Or my mom is in the room to my north. And we wouldn't say, oh, they're in front of me or behind me, left or right. They would use cardinal directions. And they think it's crazy that people can't, always understand the directionality of their environment. Like for us, to have to try to figure out which direction's north takes quite a bit of mental work, because we don't have to do that very often in our language. But for them, it's foundational. And researchers who have kind of studied this, at first they were so confused by this, and they had a really hard time understanding the language because of this. But then eventually, after several months of living with these people, they kind of recognized themselves in this larger map, and kind of always had this compass running in their brains. They describe it. So there's a really interesting podcast about this on Canvas if you want to check it out. Another interesting way this shows up is in some languages, they don't have demarcations for different colors that you and I think are foundational. So, in I believe it's some Amazonian tribe, they don't have colors. The colors blue and green are kind of lumped together. So if you say like what color is the sky, they use the same word as what color are the leaves. It's the same word. In another tribe, they don't count past three. So they'll count one, two, and then many. So they don't have words for numbers other than that. So if you say, "Oh, how many fish did you catch today?" "Oh, I caught two." Or "How many fish did you catch today?" "Many." It could be three, it could be 10, it could be 100. They just don't have a differentiation. And they have a hard time looking at, arrays of objects and determining which one's greater or less than the other because they just don't have a mental capacity because their language isn't structured that way. It's really interesting. There's some great videos on this in this playlist, so I hope you guys check those out. When we look at differences in language, dyslexia comes up quite common. So dyslexia has to do with reading. Reading is not necessary for a language to exist. That's important for you guys to understand. So a written language is not necessary for a language to be a real language, first of all. And reading is a new thing in that our species created relatively recently. It's only been the last couple thousand years that we've had written language, and only really in the past maybe 150 years that written language has become something that is more considered to be universal. At least here in the United States, there's still parts of the world where literacy is below 50%. So reading is something that's relatively new. And what we see is that some people have difficulty learning to read. And this is dyslexia is when a person has completely normal intelligence and they've been exposed to reading, they've been taught to read with adequate methods, but then they still have a real difficulty in learning how to read. Now, dyslexia isn't just flipping around a B and a D or reversing letters or switching numbers around. Dyslexia is like their brain, their eyes see the words on the page, but their brain almost scrambles it up, or it can't make sense of the letters to the phonetic sounds and then put them together into words. There's different types of dyslexia. Some are more complicated than others, and people can have multiple different types of dyslexia. And it's something that takes a lot of effort to overcome, but with a lot of additional education and therapeutic techniques, these clinicians can help people with dyslexia overcome it. But usually it's a lifelong condition and they really do struggle with it, but it can be improved. It also seems to run in families. There seems to be some sort of genetic component. And there's also a condition called dyscalculia, where a person can read letters just fine, but their brain doesn't understand numbers correctly. So seeing like arithmetic on a page would just kind of get really confusing for them, and that's called dyscalculia. We also have American Sign Language. This is a true language that we use primarily in the United States for people who are hard of hearing or deaf. And they use signs, so hand gestures, body position, facial gestures, in order to speak to other people in this community. It's really interesting. ASL, again, this is the American version of sign language, but there's sign languages all over the world. There's British sign language, there's French sign language, there's Chinese sign language. And while there are some elements that kind of stay consistent, like, a banana looks like your finger's the banana and you're peeling banana, like that's probably going to be understood pretty easily by several different groups of people, even if that's not their official sign. Other signs are much more opaque than that. But sign language is a true language. It can be taught to infants from the moment they're born. Parents can begin to sign to them. Babies actually can learn to do some basic signs before they would learn how to speak verbally. So a lot of parents use what's called baby sign, which is like a simplified like telegraphic version of some ASL signs to communicate with their babies and allow their babies to communicate back with them. But true sign language is a very rich language. It has its own grammar, timing structure, body placement. It's not just spoken English or signed English, which is like where you take English and then you just translate directly into sign. It has its own grammatical structure. So I want you guys to check out some of the videos that I posted here on YouTube for you in the playlist. There's some really interesting stuff about ASL out there, and I hope you guys get a chance to check it out. FAU used to offer ASL classes. I don't think they do that anymore, but you should check it out if it's something that you're interested in. There are a lot of excellent resources online for basic ASL classes if you're interested in that. It is a really fascinating language, and one that I think needs support. And I think it'd be really cool if you could, learn some basic communication with ASL. So some other key terms, bilingualism, you probably know what this is, but that's the ability to speak two languages. And over half the world's population is bilingual. The United States is kind of unique in this sense that we don't encourage bilingualism or just like natively have bilingualism the way that most of the world does. But it's something that is really an important skill to have across the world. Most places of the world, you have multiple languages kind of in the same community, or countries right next to each other that speak different languages, or say they speak some language like Hindi and then they also speak English, even though maybe that's not a language that would be natively in that region. Because of commerce and colonialization and history, it's become an important language in that region. Learning two or more languages does take time. Children will master the same number of vocabulary items as children learning a single language if they're learning two languages, but it has to be divided between the two languages. So let's say by age 2, a child normally knows about, let's say, 50 words. Instead of knowing 50 words in English and 50 words in Spanish, they know 25 in each. A typical 10-year-old kid knows about 40,000 words. So for the bilingual learner, it's 20,000 in each language. So they typically will have a vocabulary delay in childhood, but as they get older, the discrepancies in the vocabulary size actually become quite small. So let's say a normal adult knows about 100,000 words. They probably know like 80,000 in each or 90,000 in each. So they actually have a much larger vocabulary because it's spread across both languages. So a lot of parents are worried that if they speak two languages to their child from a young age, they're going to get confused, they're going to mix them up, they're not going to know what's going on. But it's actually a pretty minor concern. Kids will get them mixed up at first for the first few months, but then after that, they actually can overcome that, and then they actually have a lot of cognitive advantages. So it's actually better to be bilingual. We actually see better ability to what's called task switch, which is the ability to learn a rule and then have the rule switched on you and be able to follow that new rule without getting confused. So there's a lot of interesting benefits to bilingualism besides the fact that you can just communicate with that many more people. So it's something that, if you spoke two languages as a child and you can try to maintain that or get that back, it's a really important thing to try to do. Nicaraguan Sign Language. This actually comes up in the podcast that you guys will listen to for this chapter called Words from Radiolab. I hope you guys listen to that and enjoy it. But what this showed was the stages of a language's development. So not an individual's language development, but how a new language develops. So when you have people from two different areas who speak two different languages kind of coming together for the first time, they have to try to learn to communicate. So let's say someone who comes from Mexico, they come to America in an area where people don't know Spanish. So say they go to the middle of America, no one speaks Spanish. They have to try to figure out words that they have in common, or by pointing to things, a lot of gestures, they can kind of make themselves understood at a very basic level. After maybe a few months or a few years, they kind of have a common dialect of different words that they can say back and forth. Some of them are just kind of mashups of the two languages. Sometimes it's, one word from English and another word from Spanish. It's kind of like what we call like Spanglish. And that's technically in the linguistics terminology called a pidgin language, like the bird, but spelled differently. But over time, that language gets a little bit more fully fleshed out, but it's not a true language at this point. But eventually, kids are growing up in that community where this pidgin is being spoken. And as the kids grow up in this community, they're actually creating much more concrete rules for, like, they standardize the way that the language is spoken, both in grammar and the words and not just vocabulary, but the pronunciation. All of this stuff becomes much more fully fleshed out, and it becomes a true language, and we call that a Creole. Now, there's Creoles all over the world, the most famous of which, especially here in Florida, is Haitian Creole. Haitian Creole is a mix of French primarily, but some of the native language on the island, also words and parts of the languages that come from the African slaves that were brought over there. And over time, it's kind of become mashed up and it's become its own language. We could just call it Creole generally here in the United States, but what we mean is Haitian Creole, because there's also Creoles in other parts of our country and around the world. So we also have Hawaiian English Creole. That's the native Hawaiian language mixed with English. Louisiana Creole, if you think of like Creole cooking, like Southern Cajun cooking, that was French Canadians who came down. They mixed with some African slaves. They also mixed with some of the indigenous native populations in that area and some English, and it became Louisiana Creole. Gullah is a language that is found, I think it's off the coast of Georgia or South Carolina, in that area, on some islands where slaves from different parts of Africa came together, some English, and they developed their own language that we call Gullah. If you've never heard of it before, if you know the song Kumbaya, that is actually a Gullah song. So you actually have heard Gullah before, you probably just didn't know that it was actually a Creole language that was found here in the United States. There are only a few hundred speakers of Gullah left, but it is a really interesting heritage language here in the United States. We also have Jamaican Patois, which is also known as Jamaican Creole. So I know a lot of Jamaicans are like, oh, I don't speak Creole. Well, you don't speak Creole, but you speak a type of Creole, which is called Patois. And that's a mix of, again, a bunch of different languages kind of pushed together. And that is now what they use there. And it's a bit of English, it's a bit of a bunch of other things, but, you know, as a native English speaker, I don't understand Patois. It's definitely something very different that I just don't have the experience with. So these are some interesting things relating to how languages actually develop as different communities of people come together. So that is the end of this chapter, at least that we're going to cover. There is a whole section on problem solving that we are not going to go into in this chapter. So we're going to stop here. Thank you.